Good morning. So last time we were talking about the problem of increase, if you recall. How does a thing get bigger other than by being stretched, like a rubber band or balloon? The problem seemed to be that if you start out with a given thing, the way to make it bigger is by adding more matter to the matter that you start out with, but that doesn't seem to result in anything actually getting any bigger than it was. So remember, we started out with a item A here, and we asked how does A get bigger, and suggestion was, well, you start out with A, then you could add B to it like this. But nothing got any bigger because A didn't get bigger. It's still exactly the same size as it was. And B didn't get any bigger. It was over here. And then it was joined to A, so it didn't get any bigger. And AB didn't get any bigger since it didn't even exist. Right? For something to get bigger, it must exist and then grow, but AB didn't exist until you joined them together. Or if it did exist as a scattered thing, then it got smaller. It was like this big, I know. So it didn't get any bigger. Neither A, B, nor AB got bigger. So the puzzle remains. What got bigger? Seems like the only way we can say that something got bigger is if we suppose that there's some other entity present here. Like, say, for example, a house. So if we suppose that A was a house, and an addition was like another bedroom was added to the house, then you could say my house got bigger. But then the house would have to be other than A or B or AB, right? Because we already decided those didn't get any bigger, right? That is, the matter didn't get any bigger. So we'd have to have a duality of artifacts like houses and ships and so on, and the pieces of matter that are labeled A and B and so forth. We'd have to say there are two things occupying the same place at the same time. So at the first time, you'd have the house and A, and at the second time, you'd have the house and AB. The same house, but with different matter at the two different times. So you might think of it in terms of a succession of different objects which stand in some relation to the house at each of these times. So at a third time, we might add yet another room, right, C, to the house, and then the house would stand in that relation to ABC at the third time, and so forth. Right? Your house keeps on growing as you have more people living in it. You add on more and more rooms. Right? So something that started out as a small cottage might grow to a gigantic mansion. Right? Just like the ship of Theseus changed its planks from one time to another. One might think that the ship survives the change in parts or not. But if you think something gets bigger, then it seems like you're saying a thing can change its parts in some sense, because it is made up of A and then of A and B, so on and so forth. So the mereological essentialist, remember, he says that if y is part of x, then y is necessarily part of x in any possible world in which x exists. Mereological essentialist will say that nothing can get any bigger, right? Because the parts that make it up are necessary to its existence. And so it couldn't get any different parts or lose those parts. The mereological inessentialist, though, right, could believe that things can change the parts that they have and still go on continue existing as the same thing. So a mereological inessentialist about houses would believe that the house could gain and lose various parts, or a living organism could gain and lose various parts, which seems extremely plausible for living organisms, for sure. I think the case of houses and other similar artifacts would be more problematic in view of the fact that we have this cohabitation here of the house and the solid blocks. You don't really get that with the living organism because a living organism isn't a solid object. If you think about it, it's actually full of fluids and all kinds of things. So it's not clear that there is a single piece of matter that makes up any living organism. Obviously, there are many molecules and so forth that are present there, but it's not clear that they're all connected together to form a solid block. Actually, they're not. Only after rigor mortis has set in. Right? And you're all dried out and dead. But then it's not clear that you're dealing with the same thing anymore either. So it seems like living organisms, the case of living organisms would fall into a whole very different category here. We're on much clearer grounds with the artifacts that are solid objects anyway, like tables and ships and houses and so on. That's how this problem's framed anyway, this problem of increase. So if we say that there's a house in the very same place as these pieces of matter, maybe we could hold that mereological essentialism holds for the pieces of matter, that A wouldn't be the same piece of matter if it lost a part. And if you add a part on, then you've got a different piece of matter, AB, which is a different piece of matter than A, but it's the same house, right? So at both times. So we'd be saying that houses are not identical with the pieces of matter, but can coexist with them in the very same place at the same time. They're not identical because the matter can't change its parts, and the house can. That's one. Mereological essentialism is true of the matter, but pieces of matter, the solid blocks, or the timbers or bricks, but not of the house. So, and clearly, we could imagine scenarios where the house would be destroyed, but the matter would still exist. Like if you lived in a glass house, right? They say not to throw stones at other people if you live in a glass house. Right? So if that house was melted right into a blob, say, the matter would still exist, but the house would no longer exist. A blob of molten glass wouldn't be a house, but it would still be the same, say, piece of matter as you had, for example. So it seems possible to destroy one of the things without destroying the other one that's in the same place as it. So we'd be led to this dualism of artifacts and material things. And the question is then, if you believe in that kind of dualistic materialism, right, two kinds of material objects, the seems to be the pieces of matter, which arguably are more basic, and then the artifacts, which seem to be somehow some kind of way dependent on the pieces of matter. Right. Because it appears, doesn't it, that you couldn't have the house without the piece of matter, but you could have the pieces of matter without the house. The example of the glass house would show that, right, where the house is melted. The house ceases to exist, but the matter goes on. But you couldn't have a house if you didn't have some matter to build the house out of, whether it's glass or bricks or wood or whatever. Right. So it seems from that argument that metaphysically, anyway, the piece of matter is the pieces of matter or piece of matter of which the house is constructed is the more basic metaphysical entity than the artifact that is made of the matter from a metaphysical point of view. Epistemologically, that might not be true. I mean, it might be that we come to know, to understand what a house is before we understand the idea of a piece of matter. In other words, the idea of a piece of matter might be a more abstract scientific idea, right, that we learn when we study philosophy or physics or something like that. That is sort of a more abstract, general idea of a material substance as such. Whereas as little kids, we understand, before we understand those more abstract ideas like that of a material substance, we understand, houses and tables and ships and so forth. So it might be in terms of conceptual development that the idea of artifacts comes first. But this is a metaphysics class, not an epistemology class. So there it seems like the matter is the more basic thing. And we were asking last time, what's the relationship between if we postulate houses as co-occupiers, inhabitants of the same place where the object is. What's the relation between the two? And seem to come down to the idea that in some sense the matter constitutes the house, and that you can have different pieces of matter constituting the same house at different times as the house grows and shrinks, so, through the addition or subtraction of parts. So there's this idea of a constitution relation. We can say that the house is constituted by A on Monday and by AB on Tuesday and by ABC on Wednesday, and so on. So the house is constituted by A, say, on Monday. Then we add an addition. We're really fast workers, right? By Tuesday, it's got AB constituting it, right? One of these community projects, right? Where they put up a house in a day, right? What is that called? Like Jimmy Carter was running one of those things. They build houses for needy individuals, charity, right? They put them up really fast, like a barn raising, right? You get it up really fast. So by AB on Tuesday. And by, say, ABC on Wednesday, etc. So imagine 3 on Wednesday, you've got like the house A, B, C, another room. So then the question is, what is this what is this constitution relation exactly, right? What is it? There's two questions really. Can we give a plausible account or explanation of what we mean, what might be meant by such a relation? And secondly, what grounds are there for believing that the relation actually does obtain between these objects in the house? There's always the alternative of denying that the house really exists. We might say that houses are things only, so to speak, by courtesy. That is, that they're not genuine, actual objects, though it might be convenient for us to speak of them in a shorthand kind of way. But that, strictly speaking, what we have is a succession of different material objects, right? And we think of it, as a continuous object, but it's really maybe more analogous to like a flip book. Remember those little flip books they used to have? Like you have it's like a cartoon, right? You have like a picture of a man like starting to run on the first page of the thing. You get it in like Cracker Jacks or something, right? And then on the second page, he's like, right, moved his leg like a little bit there, and so on and so forth. So, and you have like 100 pages in the book, and then when you flip it, it looks like the guy's running. Right? So is there actually like a figure that's actually running? No, he's totally standing still, right? It's the pages that are moving, but not the actual guy. So it might be like that with the table. We think of, or the house, we think of it as a single enduring thing, but actually it's can be understood as a succession of ontologically distinct entities, which for practicality we regard as a single thing, because it would be so messy to have like a different name for every one of these things. So we just call it my house, even though we've replaced some of the rooms. Or in the case of the ship of Theseus, we've replaced boards and planks. It's too messy to have to call it a different thing every day, so we just call it the same thing. But actually, each thing on each different day is distinct if the parts are different. There, so that would be the alternative. You deny that there are artifacts, strictly speaking. That might be because, in a way, they seem to be arguably are mind dependent. There wouldn't be the artifact, the house or the table or the ship, unless there were humans to conceive of it as having a certain function or purpose. So, I mean, if you imagine a universe, a world without people, and in that uninhabited world, there's this natural formation, like on Mars or something, like a flat, right? A perfectly flat rock with like a pedestal-shaped thing underneath it, right? I think they actually found something like that on something that looked like a spoon. It was like a really long thing with looked like a giant spoon made of rock. Some of it was carved out of the rock by winds of eons in the deserts of Mars. But if there were no minds to think of it as a spoon, as serving the purpose of ladling out from giant bowls of soup or something, then it wouldn't really be a spoon, right? It would just be a rock, right? A rock with a rock that's shaped in that way, which we think of as spoon shape. It would seem like for the artifact to exist, there would have to be minds to regard it or intend it to have a purpose or to be used with a certain function or goal in mind, whatever that was, whether it's living in the thing or writing on it or eating soup and other liquid foods. And the like. So that would suggest that these entities are mind-dependent, these artifacts. But if they are, then how can they be true material substances? Material substances aren't supposed to be mind-dependent, right? I mean, it's true that there have been philosophers who've argued against the existence of a material world. They deny that there are truly material things, like Berkeley and Leibniz, it seems, who hold to what's known as idealism, the belief that only spirits or souls and their ideas exist. But that's a pretty radical view, and certainly departs from common sense as well. So, I mean, if we take the materialistic or physicalistic interpretation of the world around us, then it seems like we have to deny that, from this line of reasoning anyway, that artifacts truly are material things, but that's how we think of them. So then what are they? I mean, they seem not to be what they first appear to be, which casts a lot of doubt on accepting them at all then, given the problems of identifying them over time, like with the ship of Theseus, right? Like which ship was the ship of Theseus, the reassembled one that had the matter of the original ship, or the one that's made of aluminum planks. That's continuous, right? Which results from a continuous process of replacement of planks incrementally over time from the original wooden ship. Is that the original ship, or the one that's made of the original planks of the ship reassembled later on? It seems very hard to come to any kind of definitive answer to that question. If it's just a matter of, if it's just something conventional that we just choose, then, and there's no fact of the matter, that too would suggest that due to the arbitrariness of its identity, conventional nature of that identity, that it's not a real entity. And there's also the issue of being in the same place at the same time. Aristotle theorized that only those entities that fall under what he called natural kinds, that is, which can be studied scientifically and which have a nature which is subject to scientific exploration and investigation, and which fall under natural laws, therefore, that is, principles governing their behavior which are natural principles that we can inquire into in natural science, scientifically, so to speak, through empirical investigation, that only those objects really exist. So Aristotle famously denied that artifacts are genuine objects or substances. They're only things by courtesy, whatever. It's convenient to, but actually they're not there. So he gives the example of a tree. He says, well, a tree can grow. Right? It's a wooden thing that can grow. A bed, though, he says, is not a real thing, and it can't grow in that kind of way. He said if a bed did grow, it would be because, like, the wood of the bed was still alive. Like it wouldn't grow as a bed. It would, like, put out, like, branches or something. Right? If a wooden bed were to grow, so to speak, really, right? It would only be because somehow it had survived, right? Like elves in Middle Earth, like live in trees, right? So they live in living houses, right? Which can grow. Right? So if you had a bed that was still somehow like part of a living tree, right? It would put out branches. It wouldn't put out beds, right? Right? Beds wouldn't reproduce as beds, right? If a wooden bed, like, enlarged or reproduced, it would produce like another tree or a branch or something like that, which falls under scientific laws of biology dealing with the nature of trees and tree growth and so forth. So that was Aristotle's idea, that artifacts are unreal, that only things that fall under natural kinds are real. If that's the case, it would distinguish also between artifacts and living organisms. as I've suggested already, that there seems to be a difference in the idea of a growing living thing versus a growing artifact. Because living things in general, Aristotle said, fall under laws. As we've discovered, well, he thought that every living thing had an essence which determined its development, growth, and reproduction, an inner essence or nature. And you might say we've sort of discovered in a way that that's true, and that inner essence or nature is encoded in the DNA, right, which is the sort of contains the heredity or genetic blueprint for how that organism will develop. I mean, it's really amazing, right? I mean, you take any acorn, whatever, and it'll grow of a given kind, and it'll always grow into that sort of tree, right? It's not some accidental thing. It's due to laws of nature working out, which Aristotle, of course, didn't know what those laws were. He just called it an essence. But we seem to have found that there's at least some grain of truth in that, in the idea of the genetic code that's in the organism. That will determine by laws of nature how that organism will develop as it matures, and what kinds of organisms will be produced through the reproductive process. So there is that alternative, deny artifacts and only accept the existence of things that fall under natural kinds. So that would lead us to accept pieces of matter, right? Because pieces of matter fall also under scientific laws if you think about it. Right, like a piece of steel or a piece of wood. Or there are laws about these pieces of matter. There aren't really laws of nature, though, about artifacts or beds, right? Or houses. Like, what would those laws be? Right? I mean, it's true if you drop a book, it'll fall due to the law of gravity, right? But it's not as a book that it falls. It's due to the matter that it falls. The law need not mention anything about books or houses or anything. The law of gravity just says that any two pieces of matter in the universe attract each other. The reference to a house or a book or a ship, whatever, is completely gratuitous and not part of the law. So it's only qua or as a piece of matter that the book falls in the way that it does. So it has nothing to do with this being a book. The laws of physics don't concern books and houses and trees and so on. They concern the raw matter that makes up these things. So things like atoms and molecules and chunks of matter, and maybe even liquids and gases and plasmas and so forth can all be understood as natural objects of some kind. But the artifacts that are made up by these things, if we adopt the Aristotelian criterion, that the only real things are covered by natural laws, wouldn't qualify as actual objects, and we get rid of most of these or all of these co-located things, which would be nice. But it would fly in the face of the common sense perspective, where we start out believing in houses and books and ships and so forth. So it's going to be a question of simplicity versus the initial weight that our ordinary beliefs have, as well as whether the problematic aspects of artifacts can be adequately addressed, such as their apparent dependence on the mind. which seems inconsistent with their supposed material nature, and their co-location with physical objects, and finally their apparent lack of any stable or non-conventional identity criteria as well, which also casts considerable doubt on the existence. So among contemporary philosophers, some judge that common sense, the weight of common sense beliefs is so important that we should hang on to these things. And others argue that the problems and the advantages of dispensing with these weighs in favor of simplifying things and just going with the underlying material things that are law-governed, like molecules and atoms, so on. Some go even further and say we should only accept elementary particles and not accept any compound things. So they could argue their view is even simpler. So that sort of muddies the water then, because it raises the question of where you should draw the line on simplicity. If we just accept elementary particles like the electrons and photons and so on, that's simpler because then we don't need any compound things at all. So we would just have we'd have this even simpler ontology. But then we're also getting rid of organisms and conscious beings like ourselves, which seems kind of uncomfortable and paradoxical even, right, in arguing that we're going to decide or believe that we don't exist, which seems kind of self-refuting proposition. Yeah, so those are some of the alternatives. So one of the problems that has to be addressed then is how plausible is this constituting relation, right, as far as the artifacts go. If it turns out to be not explainable or not something that stands up overall to scrutiny in terms of artifact theory, then we might be persuaded to go to the Aristotelian view, or to some even more extreme view, right? That's even simpler. But definitely get rid of the artifacts. These things, they're really messy, right? With the ship of Theseus and all of that. Not having clear identity criteria, so on. So one might understand, so in answer to the first question, one might understand constitution in terms of the idea of supervenience. So what is this idea? Okay, so supervenience is a relation between entities of a more fundamental kind and entities of a derivative kind that are dependent on the more fundamental entities. It basically says that when it basically says that the properties of the supervening entity are dependent on the properties of the more basic entity upon which it supervenes. So the idea is basically this. You've got this basic entity, say like A or AB or whatever. Okay, the matter, say. And it has certain properties, like basic physical properties of the matter, its weight, its geometric dimensions, and solidity, and so on and so forth. So those are properties of these those are base or basic properties, and then you're going to have properties of the entity that supervenes on those, on that basic entity and its properties, which would be, say, the house. So you've got the matter and the house. The matter is the more basic entity. The house is said to supervene on the properties of that more basic matter in this way, that suppose you had two basic entities that were exactly alike, like you had two A's over there, right? So you had an A over here and an A over here, right? And they're exactly alike, same size, shape, mass, solidity, all that stuff, right? They're exactly alike. So it's saying that if the properties of the two basic entities are exactly alike, then the properties of the entities that depend on them will be exactly alike. And that's the basic idea of supervenience. So it's saying that the properties of the supervening entity, of the derivative entity, are determined and depend upon the properties of the more basic entity, which in this case is the matter that is said to constitute the artifact, for example, the house, or the ship, or the book, or whatever.
The properties of the supervening entity, what?
The properties of the supervening entity are determined by the properties of the entity upon which they supervene, which is the more basic entity. So if you have an entity here, A, which is matter, put together in a house-like way, whatever, right? Bricks, right? And mortar and planks and whatever, right? Bunch of matter that all does it. Then you have another one over here, exactly the same. So supervenience is the relation which says that if those two material things here are exactly alike, and say mereological essentialism holds of them, you can't, if you change them in the slightest part, they wouldn't be the same. But at that moment, right, they exist that way and are exactly the same as each other. It's saying that if the properties of this arrangement of material here are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever, and this one has exactly those same properties, then this house here, right, which is dependent on that more basic matter, because remember the house is separate from the matter, because you could add to it or take it away and still have the same house, even though you don't have the same matter. Right? So it's saying that if the properties of of these two batches of matter here are exactly the same, then the properties of the houses at that time will be exactly the same. Right? So what sort of properties am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about internal or intrinsic properties. Properties of the matter as such. Not necessarily properties dealing with its relationships to the moon or the sun or to whatever, but the internal or intrinsic properties of the matter, as in the examples I gave, right? Like weight, shape, size, solidity, all these types of properties which are intrinsic to the matter. If the two pieces of matter are the same at that time, then the intrinsic properties of the houses will be the same. So if you have a piece of matter that weighs, say, 15 tons, then the house will weigh how much? 15 tons. See, so it determines that, right? The fact that the matter has that property determines what property the house will have. And if the two batches have the same weight, then the two houses will have the same weight and the same square footage, right? And they'll be just as solid as one another and everything. Right? So you see that would work, right? So it looks like we can say that the constitution relation is a form of supervenience. Supervenience is a relation that occurs in many metaphysical discussions. It's thought, for example, just to give another example of supervenience. I think the earliest example was in ethics. Anyone know what that is? thesis was put forward that goodness is a supervenient property, that the goodness of something is not itself a physical property, but an evaluative property, a normative property, but that normative properties supervene on physical or natural properties. So you might say that being good isn't a natural, any kind of ordinary natural property, in the sense that it's not a property you can measure scientifically, right? Like color or weight or mass or anything. But suppose you have a good apple, right, here. So what would make an apple good as opposed to like a bad, rotten apple? Well, an apple would be good if it was red and juicy and sweet and shiny, right? And was not infested with wormholes and all that stuff, right? And all those are tangible, materialistic, or physical properties. You could never observe, so to speak, the goodness of the apple in itself. You have to like derive it from the fact that it's round and red and juicy and sweet and fresh and so forth, right? So suppose now you have two apples, right? And they're exactly the same in redness and sweetness and juiciness and all these physical respects. Then if this one is good, a good apple, then the other one is going to be a good apple. So therefore, the evaluative property of goodness is supervenient on the physical qualities of apples. So here the claim is that these evaluative properties supervene on material qualities of physical things, or on natural qualities, however you choose to describe it. So that was a famous example of supervenience that was put forward in the 19th century or early 20th century. Another example is that some recent philosophers of mind have said that mental properties supervene on brain properties or properties of the central nervous system. So that if you have two human beings that have exactly, if their brains or central nervous systems were in exactly the same physical state, of course that never happens, right? But if you had two people exactly in the same brain state, say, then their mental states, like their thoughts or their beliefs or what have you, would be exactly the same. That's the thesis of mind-brain supervenience. That if the physical states of the organisms are exactly the same, then any mental states that they have would be exactly the same, and therefore that mental properties supervene on material properties of brains. So here it's being said that properties of artifacts supervene on the properties of the constituting material things. Okay, so it looks like we can give a plausible answer then to what is the constitution relation. I guess the further question, though, is more perplexing. Why should we suppose that artifacts do in fact supervene on these material things? Like, why should that be? I mean, it seems mysterious, right? That you have this matter and then all of a sudden you have this other thing there, like a house that has different identity criteria. Like, why would that be? If you try to tell a story, it seems inevitable that you bring in the mental stuff, right? About how, well, we think of it as a house and we use it to shelter ourselves and live in, and that's the purpose that we assign to it. It's the reason that we put it together in the way that we did. And, if it had just happened to be a cave that existed on some uninhabited world, it wouldn't be a house until somebody moved into it and thought of it as a house. But and that brings in that whole story of that makes these artifacts mind-dependent entities, which seems to make them not really physical, but we think of them as paradigmatic physical things, leading to a kind of contradiction. Now, if there's anything that would lead us to question our folk ontological beliefs, which do have prima facie credibility, they are innocent until proven guilty. One way of proving them guilty or defective is by demonstrating they lead to a contradiction. So one argument, anyway, is that when we turn to artifacts, it's not just merely that we're multiplying entities by having a bunch of them in the same place at the same time, two or more, but beyond that, we seem to be involved in a kind of inconsistency in thinking of them as physical or material things, and at the same time, we can't really explain why we believe they're there unless we make them dependent on our beliefs and decisions about them, making them into some kind of conceptual or mental things. Right? Very different than the raw pieces of matter that we have scientific laws about, right? They exist independently of our minds totally. And there are laws of nature that they follow or obey. The artifacts don't really figure in laws at all. Or if they do, it's only in some elliptical sense, right? That it's the matter that makes them up that figures in law. So it remains kind of mysterious, and the defender of artifacts has got some work to do to show how the claim that they supervene on material things can be justified without undermining their material status. If we make them mind dependent, then what kinds of material things are they? And they clearly do seem to be mind dependent. I mean, it seems like an artifact must depend on humans by that example of imagining worlds where there are no people, and you might have things that look like artifacts, but they wouldn't be artifacts at all. They'd just be natural formations, like a giant spoon, or the old man in the mountain, whatever, some rock formation, which, right, from a certain angle looks like a face. That kind of thing. Wouldn't be an artifact unless we started to use it as one and adopted certain attitudes, psychological attitudes toward it, I think. So, okay, so any other discussion on that? You can see it's a big area, and we can't hope to definitively settle what exists today, but we can at least see the contours of what some of the main positions are here. So to sum up, if you do believe in artifacts, you're going to have some problems with multiplying entities and with coming up with identity conditions and with justifying the idea of supervenience of these things on pieces of matter. If you eliminate artifacts, then you may be pushed in the other direction of eliminating all compound things and just getting down to like electrons being. So one way to find the middle ground is to go with Aristotle and say it's the criterion is whether the things fall under natural laws. And that would allow you to bring in, to justify the existence of both simple pieces of matter and compounds, because they all fall under laws. Like, for example, the laws of biology cover the existence of naturally existing living organisms, which obviously are compound, as well as molecules and atoms, which are compounds that fall under chemical and physical laws. So the Aristotelian approach of making the answer depend on whether the entity in question genuinely falls under scientific laws would allow you to find something in the middle, not so generous as allowing in ill-behaved artifacts, like the ship of Theseus and so on, but not so strict as to only allow fundamental particles. We allow you to have compound things like atoms, molecules, and living organisms, and chunks of matter, even since they fall under laws, like the matter that composes a billiard ball or whatever. So I guess that's the kind of view that I would try to defend as a kind of compromise position. Because I wouldn't want to say that we don't exist, I think, and that only electrons do. It seems throwing the baby away with the bathwater if you do that. Okay, so no further comments or questions about these puzzles of identity. Right, I did want to mention, before moving on to some thoughts about personal identity, which forms yet another area. Two further principles of identity that are closely related to the two Leibnizian principles of the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identicals. These are due to a philosopher named McTaggart, John McTaggart. And they're kind of like the flip side of these other principles. I guess they're the contrapositives of them, if you know logic. It's a contrapositive. They're called the diversity of the dissimilar and the dissimilarity of the diverse. So the contrapositive, so let's start out with the, the indiscernibility of identicals, right? That was the Leibnizian principle that seemed to be the more well-grounded of the more certain of the two. That identical things have the same properties. If X is identical with Y, then X has every property Y has, and Y has every property X has. Though we may need to relativize that to time, as we've seen, to allow things to change over time. Because remember, Philip was very short as a 5-year-old and very tall as an adult, but still retained his identity through time. So at any given time, anyway, if X is identical with Y at that time, then at that time, X and Y have all the same properties. So that's the identity of, that's the indiscernibility of identicals principle. So if you contrapose this, you would get the McTaggart's principle. John McTaggart, late 19th century idealist, British idealist. It's called the dissimilarity of the diverse. And it says, if X is other than Y, if X is not identical with Y, then X has some property Y lacks, or Y has some property X lacks. So this is a contraposition of the indiscernibility of identicals. So in logic, the contrapositive of P implies Q is what? Not Q implies not P. Yeah, not Q. Implies not P. So you flip them and put a negative sign, negation sign in front of each one at the contrapositive. So this says if X is identical with Y, right? The indiscernibility of identical says if X is the same thing as Y, then they have the very same properties. And this says if X is not identical with Y, then they differ in their properties. So and then you have the indiscernibility of identicals principle. I mean the identity of indiscernibles principle. This one is more controversial. May not be true depending on how you interpret the idea of a property. But given Leibniz's interpretation of properties, we concluded that it wasn't very plausible because you could have worlds with objects that were exactly alike and related in symmetrical, exactly similar ways. Like a world in which there were, say, a number of souls, unlocated souls, non-physical souls with exactly the same mental state. That would refute the idea that indiscernible things, these souls would all be indiscernible, but they'd be different souls. One would be me and the other one would be you. They'd all be thinking the same thing. Have different centers of consciousness. That's the identity of indiscernibles. According to Leibniz, that couldn't happen. God would have no reason for creating worlds like that again. Right, but to defend that, you have to believe in, first, that God exists and is totally perfect, and furthermore, that there must be a sufficient reason for everything, which is even more dubious, since it's inconsistent with current science, which says that there are undetermined events, like that, in quantum mechanics, things that just happen randomly, for which no sufficient reason can be given. And also, if you believe in free will, you would have to believe that as well, right? If you believe that two people with exactly the same causal history up to a certain time could make different decisions about a given thing. That they have the free will to decide what to do. So the identity of indiscernible, so that says that things that are exactly alike must be identical, which is dubious. But anyway, McTaggart's principle that's equivalent to that is that the principle of the diversity of the dissimilar. Okay, so I've got this. I've made a mistake here. Sorry. This one should be the diversity of this. So you got to rewrite this here. I apologize. All right, so. Right, so this is the diversity of the dissimilar things, right? X and Y. Let me see. Hold on a second. No, maybe I'm not wrong. Let's think about this for a minute. Dissimilar things. No, that's right. Do this over here. All right, so The diversity of dissimilar is going to say that if x and y are dissimilar, if x has a property y has, or y okay, if x has a property y lacks, or y has a property x lacks, then they are not identical. Okay, so this one is correct, I believe. It's a true principle, right? This corresponds or is equivalent to the principle of the indiscernibility. Of identicals. So that's the one that says that identical things have the same properties. If x is identical with y, then x has every property y has, and y has every property x has. So these two are equivalent. Right, and these are the contrapositive, right? These are contrapositives of the so here we have if P, if X is Y, then Q, they have the same properties. And here we have, if they don't have the same properties, right, if not Q, then they're not identical, not P. So it is of the form of the contrapositive. The indiscernibility of identicals is the stronger of the two Leibnizian principles, saying that a single thing must have the same properties as itself, which when relativized to time can't possibly be false. It seems highly plausible. So this principle of the diversity of the dissimilar would have the same same degree of certainty. It seems like it must be true that dissimilar things will not be identical to each other because they have different properties. They can't be the same thing. Okay. Then we have the identity of indiscernibles, which we've raised doubts about based on the idea that you could have a world with two or more exactly similar things arranged in some symmetrical way or which aren't in space at all, like souls. So that would be the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, which is much more controversial based on the principle of sufficient reason and on the existence of God, a perfect God according to Leibniz, both of which are disputable assumptions. So the corresponding equivalent principle, which would have the same dubious quality, or controversial quality at least anyway, right, would be the principle of the dissimilarity of the diverse, right? Because for the same reason, you could say diverse things might be exactly similar if you accept those arguments about the spheres, like a row of spheres, which are right, exactly similar and evenly spaced that goes on forever. They would all have exactly the same qualities and relations as one another. And if you don't believe in infinity, right, some people would question the possibility of an actual infinite. And so you couldn't have infinitely many. So. And then there would be a difference, right? If it was finite, because each one would have a certain number to its east and a certain number to its west. It wouldn't be the same number. So. Yeah, but you could still get around that with a non-Euclidean or spherical universe. According to Einstein's theories, a universe could be a gigantic spherical three-dimensional, like a Riemannian geometry, which is a spherical three-dimensional geometry. So there, if you start off on a journey, eventually you'll, right off into space, whatever, you'll come back to your starting point, just like you do if you crawl on the Earth, right? You come back to your starting point. So there you just have to have a finite number of spheres that are evenly spaced, all exactly alike intrinsically in the spherical universe, without violating the principle that you can't have more than that you can't have an infinitude of objects, if you think that's a problem. So yeah, so Leibniz isn't going to win on that one. Once you bring in these new discoveries in mathematics and science and physics and stuff, it's quantum mechanics and non-Euclidean geometry and all these things. Leibniz's arguments don't hold up, even if you accept a God. Because the principle that he must have some sufficient reason to do these things has to be rejected. So the contrapositive of the identity of indiscernibles, okay, so that says that if X has every property Y has, and Y has every property X has, making them indiscernible, right? Then they would have to be identical according to this principle. Then X is identical with Y. McTaggart said the contrapositive of this, which is the dissimilarity of the diverse principle, which we can question. Doesn't seem to hold up. So these two are equivalent by the contraposition rule, that contrapositives are logically equivalent. So what would it say then if we contrapose that? We take the consequent and negate it, and then make that the antecedent, and then we take the antecedent, then negate it, and make it the consequent, right? So what would that be? Dissimilarity of diverse from the identity of indiscernibles. We'd have to contrapose it. So we'd get, if X is not identical with Y, then what? They are dissimilar. X has a property that Y doesn't have, or Y has a property that X doesn't have. So it would be if X is other than Y, if they are diverse, which is the negation of the consequent here, then X has some property Y lacks, or Y has some property X lacks. So anyway, it's important to be aware of these two corollaries of Leibniz's original principles. Sorry for the mix-up there. too many D's running around in my brain. But that should clarify it all. Yeah, so P implies Q is always equivalent to not Q implies not P in general. For example, right, if Cruz is president, then a Republican is president would be equivalent to if a Republican's not president, then Cruz is not president. And so on. For any example you can think of like that, always works. Right? If Bernie Sanders is president, then a Democrat is president. If a Democrat's not president, then Bernie Sanders isn't president. Well, that's assuming he's a Democrat. I guess he is now, but he used to be an independent. Right? Well, he had to be competitive, yeah. So who knows what would have happened. I'm glad at least one of the parties is hanging together. Doesn't seem to be true on the other side right now. A lot of problems figuring out what their identity is. All right, so shall we move on to the next topic on our syllabus, which is individuation, I believe. A problem of individuation. Oh, we only have a minute or two, so we're able to do very much here. But anyway, our next topic is the problem of individuation. I don't really have enough time to talk about personal identity, which I also mentioned today, but I would recommend to you, in lieu of that, to read the article in the Historical Dictionary of Metaphysics on personal identity, and it will explain everything. It's not very long. It's highly compressed. And you may want to come in next time if you have any questions or would like to explore some of those issues, which have a lot of interesting practical applications in ethics as well. Having to do with the beginning of life and end of life kinds of issues. Because of the question, under what conditions does a person continue to exist and consequently enjoy moral and legal rights of various sorts? Is the fetus identical with the 90-year-old person? Or is the person who has become comatose at 98 years old, whatever, identical with the infant that he was 98 years before, that sort of thing. So, at any rate, our next topic will be focusing on this issue of individuation. Individuation is basically looking at the question of what makes one thing that exists at a given time separate or different, diverse from another thing of the same sort that exists at that time. So if you have two objects of the same sort, say two material objects, what makes one of them, in virtue of what is one of them different than the other at that time? So if you have two basketballs, right, what would make one of them distinct or diverse, I should say? What differentiates one thing from another? What's the metaphysical explanation? What accounts for this thing here being a different thing than this other one that's over there. So that's the basic problem of individuation. So we will resume with that, and also with prior to that, if there are any questions about personal identity, we can take those up at that time before we go into individuation. And I will get to your exams and get the grades for those posted in short order.